by the Institute for European Studies here at IU. This is our sort of first talk of the year that we've sponsored. And we also want to thank the Center for International Business Education Research at Kelley School of Business, Department of Economics, and Department of Political Science for helping sponsor our visitor here, Dr. Michael Geary. Before I talk a little bit about our speaker and turn the floor over to him, I wanted to call your attention. We're also sort of hoping to use this to sort of plug some of our upcoming events throughout academic year 2013-2014, and we have a handout that we've been circulating, so take a look at that. We've got a speaker on labor, industrial relations and social policy in Europe, Kirsten Heyman of University of Central Florida, coming later this semester. We also have Dr. Yannis Varoufakis talking about lessons from the current euro crisis in November. And then so far we've got two speakers in spring semester, Sarah Goodman on civic immigration and immigration in Europe, and a roundtable actually, a discussion about pathways out of the crisis in Europe. Maybe we can have you back for that one. That'll be in...
I'll check the forecast first.
Yeah. So, that'll be in the summer. Okay. Yeah, don't cut the... of course it rained today, and so... Anyway, pick a nicer day for that. That'll be in March. Anyway, and we also have some flyers going around if you're not on our listservs and want to get on our listservs, or we have a brand new website, and so I want to use this opportunity to kind of inform people about the Institute for European Studies here at IU and encourage you to check us out, as it were, online. So today it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Geary to campus. He's an assistant professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, where his work focuses on modern Europe and the European Union. He's a first-class honors graduate of the National University in Ireland, and his PhD is from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. In January 2012, he was awarded a European Parliament Garamec Research Fellowship to the College of Europe in Warsaw. So, and currently, Dr. Geary is a fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. as part of their Global Europe program. And as of one more day, I guess you are, right?
Exactly.
We're just getting him before he flies back on the other side of the pond. He's the author of two books, Enlarging the European Union, The Commission Seeking Influence, 1961 to 1973, and he just had the book launch party yesterday for this book, so very excited about that. And another book, An Inconvenient Wait, Ireland's Quest for Membership in the EEC, 1957 to 1973. He also has published many articles, op-eds, and books chapters on the EU and the current crisis. He also serves as member of the Advisory Council of the European Movement for Ireland. Prior to joining Maastricht, he worked as a General Secretary to the EU Council of Ministers in Brussels, and he has previously held positions lecturing and otherwise at National University of Ireland, Maynooth, Trinity College Dublin, and the University of Malaysia, and has presented additional lectures all over the place. So we're very glad you could come here, and welcome to IU.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be here in Indiana, my first trip to this part of America. I have been to Chicago quite recently, but it's not quite the same. I want to thank Professor Hellweg and those who are involved in organizing this event. It's great to see people here in the US still interested in Europe, given that there is a pivot, or otherwise, in Washington at least, to other parts of the world, notably in Asia. So it's great that they're flying the flag of Europe, and that Europe still matters globally. I'm going to present a lecture today. I suppose the origins of this event were at the Wilson Center in DC, where I had the privilege of really being, I would say, a student of one of your distinguished professors here, Professor Triggs, who was a colleague of mine this year. We were both fellows at the Wilson Center, and it really was a learning curve. My knowledge of the Western Balkans was certainly enhanced by her knowledge, and we collaborated on an event that she was very quick to move on, the Serbia-Kosovo agreement back in April, May. So it's really a pleasure to see her again, and I'm very happy that this all worked out the day before I fly out of Washington and the day after my book launch. all time quite nicely. So today's lecture, and I have to quickly hurry up because I want to leave time for questions and answers towards the end. So what I'm going to do today is really talk on the sovereign debt crisis that has affected the European Union, a crisis that we are now in the 5th year of, and doesn't seem the crisis, at least, is over. The crisis of the euro, the crisis, the talk, this repetition that you hear quite often on this side of the Atlantic in particular, that, you know, will the euro collapse, will the EU collapse, and all of this. And to be honest, I'm actually very sick of this nonsense. You know, I'm sick of this Armageddon type, apocalyptic type discourse that you hear quite regularly by those who I would say should be more informed. I mean, Richard Haas, one of your very eminent diplomats, has published a book recently where he talks about the decline of Europe. And I know our Irish ambassador yesterday, who was just recently our ambassador to the UN, took him to task about this. You know, I mean, this rhetoric about the decline of Europe is a little bit premature. And, you know, if Europe was in decline, I doubt that the Americans would be paying so much interest in the transatlantic free trade and investment partnership, which will create the world's largest trade alliance. So I would encourage you, as I do to my European students, to keep an open mind about the European project, whether or not you believe or otherwise in it. I don't think it's going to fail anytime soon. So the lecture today is going to give you a background to the sovereign debt crisis, and in particular a background to the euro and EMU, Economic and Monetary Union. I will just assume, since I don't know any of you, that you have really not much of a background. So apologies if you know all this already. If you don't, you will hopefully learn something. So I will give you an overview of EMU very briefly from the 1920s until 1990. Ideas about a single currency just did not emerge in the 1980s. Those ideas of European integration, and particularly a single currency, date back to the early years of the League of Nations. And then I will discuss the stages of EMU, the stages of the development of the euro during the 1990s, and then, where's my list? And then I will discuss briefly the politics of EMU membership, Economic Monetary Union membership. It wasn't just, you know, a question of meeting criteria and conditions. There was also quite a lot of politicking involved, because in 1990 or the 1990s, no country that joined the European Union after the first enlargement qualified for membership of EMU, except Ireland. Only one country qualified. So the question remains, why did all these other countries end up being part of the euro on the 1st of January 2002? And I will discuss two case studies briefly, Ireland and Greece. Both countries have had major economic declines, some more glorious than others. Ireland's one is probably the most embarrassing fall from grace, given that it was held up as being the Celtic tiger. Ireland was making more microchips during the 1990s and 2000s than Silicon Valley. But again, now we have one of the highest public debt to GDP ratios in the world. And finally, I'm going to discuss some of the future developments within the next 24 to 48 months. Actually, also this coming weekend with the German elections. But some of the big things that are happening and how we might see these things playing out and affecting the integration process. So that's really the overview. Well, I will try to get through as much as I can, and then leave some time for questions. I picked this topic largely because the crisis that we lived through in Europe and also in the United States has somewhat, the talk of crisis has died down, but it's like Hurricane Sandy. The hurricane is gone, but you know, we still have this mess that we got to deal with post-hurricane. And this is what we're dealing with now in Europe. A mountain of unemployment, a mountain of debt, and how we deal with these. Okay. So economic and monetary union is hugely important, largely because this is where the central focus on is at the moment in Europe. We're not dealing with any other policy field, at least no other policy field is as problematic as EMU. So here's background to the policy. We created a common market in the 1950s in the European Union, 6 member states, you know the history. We did it incrementally, sector by sector. Jean Monnet, through a number of failures in the 1950s, political community, defense community, there was no appetite for that type of integration, and it was then realized that we could build Europe, we could build an integration process sector by sector by sector. Hence, we start with coal and steel, and then we move to more economic union in the 50s, in late 50s and into the 60s. There was always talk about monetary union, an ever closer union, that once you start off with a common market and developing a customs union, then there's other elements that need to be considered as well. So you have a certain amount of spillover, and I hate using these political science terms because sometimes they're a little bit redundant. Because what does all of this mean? So if you have, for example, a farm and you're producing goods for the market, well, there is a public health element to that as well. Is what you're producing safe? Well, then we need a health and safety policy. There's an environmental factor. Where does all the slurry go? So then you need to develop an environmental policy to deal with this. So on the customs union and the common market, well then, you have all these additional costs to businesses associated with exporting their goods around Europe in terms of currency costs and exchange costs. So we're moving towards the customs union, monetary union by the 1970s. But it's a longer history than that. Gustav Stresemann argued for a single currency or common currency between member states, economic union, back as early as 1929. So we've this ideas on European integration, ideas on single currency, on closer integration, we know go back much further than even the 1920s when this pan-Europa movement was getting started after World War I. You have ideas on European Union and closer Europe going back to Roman times. I mean, one could argue that the Roman Empire was in itself a union. Things gather greater speed then towards late 1960s when you have the Hague Summit, this very, very important milestone in the history of the European Union. Charles de Gaulle has just resigned in April of '69, resigns from the French presidency over a very minor detail of a constitutional change. Georges Pompidou succeeds him, and the issues are on the table really are widening of the European Union, which is bringing more member states in, but also completion and deepening. The French attitude was, well, we will allow Britain, Ireland and Denmark into the European Union if we can complete some of the policies and deepen some of the policies that we're talking about first, because they were afraid that if you bring Britain in, Britain would roll back some of these ideas, or at least would not allow them to continue. So the community wants to go further much quicker, largely because enlargement is around the corner. British are going to come in now. De Gaulle is gone, his last great obstacle to enlargement. But there's fear that if the policies are not agreed and become law before enlargement, the British will just veto this. So the timing is hugely important. So the 6 member states of the 1960s want greater coordination of economic policies and monetary cooperation. There's too much fluctuation between currencies, and this will only increase by bringing in 3 new currencies: Danish, British, and Irish currencies, and of course Norwegian currencies, because Norway also at that stage was going to apply. So it already kicks off with the Hague Summit. The ideas for monetary union really grow out of this summit, and then throughout the 1970s, there is a huge amount of activity within the European Union, or within the European community, also a huge amount of international activity on the monetary side. There's the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, there's 2 oil shocks in the space of 1 decade. We have 73, and then where you have got massive stagflation within the European community, in Europe in general, and then latter half of the 1970s where you have the fall of the Shah of Iran, and again, huge turmoil again with another oil shock. So there's huge attempts, or there's huge economic problems facing the Europeans. It's only towards the end of that decade, beginning of the 1980s, that you see European member states kind of consciously deciding that they tried themselves during the 70s to deal with these crises. So there was kind of a pullback from the integration process. There is all of these national economic problems: rising unemployment, reduction in living standards, rise in inflation. And member states are trying to deal with these problems themselves, not very successfully. And then we have the second oil shock of 1979, the fall of the Shah of Iran. So then by the 1980s, there's a rethinking that maybe the European community we can use the European community as a vehicle to deal with these economic issues. And this is where, when we are slowly but surely moving in the direction of economic and monetary union. The road is cleared. Not only do we have the oil shocks, but we've also got the shock of Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister. So Thatcher becomes Prime Minister in 79, and for the next 5 years, until 84, the Europeans, the member states are dealing with the budgetary question. Britain pays a lot of money into the EU budget. Margaret Thatcher argued we get very little back. We're paying huge amounts in, it's all going on common agricultural policy, but Britain is not an agricultural nation. So Margaret Thatcher viewed the European project as, you know, what's in it for us? I mean, how much of the cake should we get? The Continentals argued, well, it's kind of a community system. You know, it's part of a club, and you should understand that you're not going to get the same amount back that you put in. She didn't view it like that. So by 1984, at the Fontainebleau summit in France, there's an agreement that Britain gets permanent rebate. Every year, Britain gets about €1 billion back from the European budget. That question is settled. The Europeans can move on. The French finance minister, Jacques Delors, he becomes Commission president. And he has seen how the member states, or how Britain has held back the process, and how much time has been consumed in dealing with the budgetary question. And just as an example of that, the member states create the European Council in 1973, 74, this kind of a meeting of heads of state and government. They meet twice a year. And so there's a Dublin summit, there's an Athens summit, and they all end in disaster. Margaret Thatcher demands money back. There's no, at the Athens summit, there's not even a communique, which is a sign of how bad things get. So there's very little movement on other policy fields. Margaret Thatcher is like, well, if you want to develop EMU, if you want new policy fields, that's fine. Go ahead, but use the existing budget. Don't expect us to give you more money, because at that stage in the 1970s, early 80s, into even the mid-80s, about 70% of the entire EU budget is being spent on agriculture alone, on one policy field. And there's no talk of reform. So we have developed butter mountains, we have got wine lakes, milk lakes, and all this surplus food that farmers produce is dumped on the international market. So it's very, very costly policy. Thatcher wants reform, and before there's movement in any other policy field, she wants this resolved. So in 1984, Thatcher gets her money back, a large chunk of it, and also then she gets reform firmly put on the European agenda, reform the common agricultural policy. And then the member states can move ahead in these other policy fields, particularly economic and monetary union. Delors is instrumental. Delors is really a pro-European socialist. He believes in an ever closer union, literally an ever closer union. So he sees himself as taking on the baton from those earlier federalists from the 1950s and 60s, like Spinelli, the Italian, Hallstein, the German first commission president. And he sees himself really as furthering the integration process, completing the single market, but going further than that in terms of political and economic union. So the Delors report is very, very important. This sets out the plan for developing EMU. Delors, of course, would have liked to have gone further. He didn't want to stop at simply economic and monetary union, he wanted a political union. What was, of course, tried in the 50s and they failed. But he thought that the atmosphere was right. In particular, you have a very strange alliance in France and Germany. You've Helmut Kohl, and you've got François Mitterrand, you've got a socialist in France, and you've got a Christian Democrat in Germany, in West Germany. And if you look at the relationship between France and Germany, they seem to work best when you have got a socialist in Paris and a Christian Democrat in Bonn or Berlin, or vice versa. Unlike the current, the current combination is probably an anomaly, because François Hollande and Angela Merkel are not the best of buddies, largely because Hollande is very slow with economic progress, economic reform in France, and Merkel is very annoyed at that. But usually they work quite well on opposite ideological political spectrums. So you've got François Mitterrand, who's really, really keen to leave his mark on the European stage. Helmut Kohl, of course, sees himself as the heir to Adenauer on the European project. So they're pushing this. And they meet then in Maastricht, in the fabulous Dutch town of Maastricht, in the very, very south of the Netherlands, bordering Brussels, bordering Belgium and Germany. And you can actually walk within 5 minutes into each of those countries from the city. And there's a European summit in Maastricht in 1992. The leaders meet. The leaders, John Major is British Prime Minister. There's Kohl, there's Mitterrand. And they meet in Maastricht, but they don't meet to sign a treaty. It just that happens by default, actually. They come, they agree on certain ideas, and then it just actually, they almost stagger into a treaty. They decide there and then they will agree to create economic and monetary union. And they kind of reinvent the process. So now they have, before we have simply the single market, this is the European community. Its name is the European Community. It was the European Economic Community. They changed it to EC once the treaties, the institutions were merged. But then in 1992, they changed the name to European Union. So you can see they're adding new areas to it as well. After Maastricht, it's not simply just an economic union. They've now added 2 more pillars. So there's a single market pillar and 2 more, justice and home affairs. And then the 3rd pillar is foreign common and security policy. So they're branching out and trying to complete this ever closer union. One of the problems was that Helmut Kohl couldn't really sell the idea of political union at Maastricht. They couldn't agree on political union as well as EMU. Political union died in Maastricht, at least for now. So the Maastricht Treaty, and I often say to my students and people who complain about EU treaties, if you ever wanted to stop the process of European integration or slow it down sharply, you should have said no to Maastricht. Maastricht was really the treaty that introduced so much more, the first real reform treaty since the Treaty of Rome in 1957. It introduces, apart from the single market and trying to complete the single market, which is something that all Europeans want, whether you're a skeptic or a supporter, you want the single market to be finalized because it means you can export more, there's less tariffs and barriers to trade. It's a win-win for export-minded countries. Even the British want a single market completed. But for the other pillars, EMU EMU was attached to the single market, but for the other pillars, justice and home affairs and foreign common security policy, you see the European Union getting new competences in areas that it previously didn't have any control over or any remit to touch. So Maastricht is a really, really important treaty, a milestone in the integration process. And what this does really is kind of set out the roadmap or the infrastructure for the euro throughout the 1990s. It would be divided into 3 stages. The most important element here is the Stability and Growth Pact. It's a rule book. And rules, of course, as we know, are meant to be broken. The Stability and Growth Pact was meant to get all member states to gear their economies in such a way that they met all of the criteria in order to join the euro. So there was strict fiscal, important budgetary discipline. That national debt had to be within a certain percentage of GDP. All member states who wanted to be considered for euro membership had to strictly adhere to the Stability and Growth Pact. So throughout, and as part of the Maastricht Treaty, they set down these criteria for membership of the euro, for EMU. Also then the creation of the European Central Bank. This also emerges from Maastricht, which is now based in Frankfurt. No small coincidence. In hindsight, it's kind of interesting that the European Central, the ECB is located in Frankfurt, and of course, in today, of course, Germany plays such a huge role in monitoring spending in many European countries. So it was a prescient, I would suppose, a move that the European Central Bank goes to Germany, while the other institutions of lesser importance today are elsewhere, like the Food Authority is in Italy, But so throughout the 1990s, then countries are trying their best to get in to meet the criteria of the Stability and Growth Pact and to meet the deadline by 1999. So we got 11 countries are initially selected. And by 1998, the ECB is created, and so the whole framework is largely in place. And then on the 1st of January 2002, we have the single currency. And there's a lot of excitement at the launch of this new currency. I know I was in West Cork in Ireland, and we got up that morning, and we were so eager to go to the supermarket to buy something, anything, just to get the new money. And yeah, it was like, you know, it was also quite interesting. It was kind of a drug for us, and we couldn't get enough of the stuff over the next decade or so. But so from 1999 onwards, then the euro is a real currency. It is not in circulation yet. It doesn't circulate until 2002. Greece joins the third stage in 2001. Notes and coins are available from the 1st of January. Slovenia joins in 2007, Cyprus and other countries, and then there's been an incremental increase since then. Estonia, I think so far as I remember, is the last country to formally, so we've got about 17 countries now, up from 11 who've joined the single currency. So it is the second most important reserve currency in the world. It is used by a further, apart from the 11 member states, or the 17 member states who use it, it is used, 150 million people outside of the Eurozone use currencies that are pegged to the euro. So it is a hugely important currency, and this is something we tend to forget when we are talking about the collapse of the euro, that it is the world's second most important reserve currency. So again, in many ways, I often find talk is cheap. You know, yeah, let's abolish the euro, but my goodness, you know, there is a huge, there would be a huge tsunami impact if we did that, because you know it is so embedded into the global economy at this stage. So the euro, economic and monetary union is completed. The euro is out there and it's widely circulating. So during the 2000s, when you have all of these European countries using the same currency, interbank lending and money flows quite freely. So Ireland can borrow money from France, who is also in the euro, and you know, it's all been regulated by the ECB, so interbank lending becomes so free and easy. You can borrow money from various different banks in the Eurozone, where interest rates and all of these issues are regulated by the ECB. So you see, well, we only see this actually after the collapse of the whole process, because no one really knew who was exposed to what. Like, none of us knew that the Greeks had borrowed, what, 75 billion from France, or 15 billion from the Germans, or 5 billion from the British, or from the Portuguese. It's only after all of this, you know, mess was created that the bigger picture was revealed, that, you know, everybody was so involved in the subprime market here in America. And as Jose Manuel Barroso, the European Commission President, frequently mentions on trips to the United States, it was their fault that this whole thing collapsed. You know, it started in America. This is not just a European problem. So when Barack Obama, you know, waxes lyrical about, you know, Europeans fixing their system, he tends to forget that it was the subprime market here in the United States that actually kick-started this whole process. Not that the Europeans were innocent by any measure of that. But so Lehman Brothers, that the collapse of this really was exposed what I suspect a lot of people in the know knew, but wasn't, you know, they weren't quite worried that there was massive amounts of exposure, that the Irish banking system was massively overexposed to a small number of individuals, where, for example, if Professor Trix decides that she wants to buy a house in Dublin and knock it down and build an apartment complex, and she goes to the bank and she says, yeah, the house costs like 4 million. Yeah, she buys the house, they give her 4 million. And she tells the bank, well, I'm going to build, you know, 40 apartments, so you get your money back 10 times. And she buys the house for 4 million, and then she goes looking for planning permission. But she doesn't get it, because she's rejected, because there's objections by neighbours, it's too high. And she goes and appeals to the last board, we call it Board Planola in Ireland, the planning board, and they say no. And that's it. And then she's like, oh, I got 4 million. I just borrowed 4 million, and the house is worthless now. I can't build anything on this. But I still owe the bank 4 million. The bank is still exposed to 4 million. That bank has probably borrowed that 4 million from some other bank on the continent or elsewhere, or has leveraged something else against that loan. And that's replicated. We'll get to that in a moment. So all of this during the 2000s really was, in Ireland's case and in many other European countries, it was, let the good times roll. There was really little oversight, and this is one of the things that I've really been very annoyed at, because for those of you who are doing economics here, on the macro level, the European Commission would have seen what was being borrowed. So what was the exposure on a macro level?